We have seen in the previous videos, both in the authentication manager and authentication provider. So there is a method called authenticate, which accepts and returns authentication object. So that means this authentication object is very crucial to the framework whenever it want to perform any authentication of an user. So let's try to understand what is this authentication object and how it is different from user details interface or object that we have discussed previously along with user detail service and password encoder. So authentication interface, it implements principal interface which is from the Java API. So principal is an interface from Java security API and it has only one method which indicates the name of the user. But coming to the authentication interface, it has various methods like get authorities, what are the authorities associated for this user, get credentials, which usually represents the password of the user, get details, the additional details that we want to maintain associated for this user, like the IP address he's trying to log in. Any such additional details we can maintain and fetch it from the get details method. And get principal is the one which is extended from this principal interface, and using that principal we'll come to know the name of the user, and is authenticated is the one which maintained by the framework whenever the user is authenticated. So by default this value is false, but after successful authentication this is authenticated will be changed to true, and this will continuously maintained by the framework at various stages of the authentication. And set authenticated, so this is the method that we use whenever we want to change the authentication of the user is true or false. So now we understand authentication is an important interface maintained by the Spring Security, and it has all the associated details of an user while performing authentication. So let's try to look into the code also. So as I was saying, authentication interface extends principal, and this is from the Java library. It has only one method, getName, which returns the name of the user. And under that, we have methods like getAuthorities to understand the authorities associated with the user, followed by getCredentials. Usually, this is the password of the user, followed by additional details that we want to maintain using getDetails, and getPrincipal usually referred to the username, and is authenticated is a boolean which indicates whether the user is logged in successfully or not, and set authenticated is a method which we call whenever we want to update the is authenticated boolean. So now we understand this is the authentication object that maintained by the Spring Security. But if you remember from our previous implementation inside our application, we are dealing with user details. So if I go to my user detail service implementation of my application, we are calling load user by username, and it will return user details. And we know by default Spring Security will leverages DAO authentication provider. But how the conversion between these user details and authentication is happening? Let's try to look into the code by going to the DAO authentication provider. I'm just going to DAO authentication provider, and we don't have authenticate method inside this, which will be called by manager, that is being maintained inside this class, which is abstract user details authentication provider. I'll go to the authenticate method. So from this authenticate method, a call will go to the retrieve user, so which is implemented inside DAO authentication provider itself. Here you can see by default this is calling my user detail service which is implemented, and the return type is user details. Okay, so and the return type of retrieve user also user details. Let's try to backtrace and see where the conversion is happening. Here we are capturing the user, and if you come down, so this is the place where it will convert this user to an authentication object. If you go and look into this create success authentication, The return type is authentication and it leverages that is received from our user detail service and it is converting into a type of username password authentication token. So this is an implementation of abstract authentication token which internally extends authentication. That means as long as you are returning this, since it is implementing authentication interface itself, the framework will not complain and by this way our user details is converting into authentication details. But you may ask what is the need of authentication and user details, two different mechanisms to maintain the similar user details? The answer is Spring Security want to give you that flexibility at each and every layer. So my user details manager and user detail service will leverage my user details, whereas my authentication manager and authentication provider, they always leverage authentication interface. So that's why Spring Security always give you that flexibility of maintaining as per your requirement. But if you don't want user details to be maintained, you can always free to customize the authentication provider as per requirement and free to use directly the authentication object. So now we understand what is authentication, authentication provider in the last few videos. So let's try to implement and customize authentication provider based upon our custom requirements inside our application and see how it works. Thank you and see you in the next video. Bye.